listening to the podcast series Introducing the Tanakh with Brooke Lester. Thank you for downloading. This episode is Wisdom, Part B, The Dissenting Wisdom. I talked in the first part of this episode about the conventional wisdom reflecting a comfortable and optimistic orientation towards God and towards the world. That is, for the conventional wisdom, the world is a sensible place, a sense-making place, in which it's self-evident what's the right thing or the wrong thing to do, that righteous action will normally be rewarded with blessing, and so it's wise to choose it, and that wicked action will normally be rewarded with punishment, with curse. And so it's a foolish or unwise course of action. The conventional wisdom is grounded certainly in experience, but it's grounded in a very particular experience. It's grounded in the experience of the world as a normally sense-making place, created by God to have these kinds of fairly dependable consequences for action. But there's an entire stream of wisdom material, both internationally in Egypt and in Mesopotamia, and also in Israelite wisdom, that represents another kind of experience that appears to represent the experience of radical and unameliorated injustice. What do I mean when I say unameliorated? That is, it's not fixed. The experience of injustice that is not taken care of. Injustice that's not taken care of, not fixed, not addressed. Unaddressed injustice. That is, the dissenting wisdom represents and validates this counter experience of the world. The experience of the world is a place that doesn't always make sense, in which right action goes unrewarded a significant percentage of the time, in which wicked action goes unpunished a significant percentage of the time. That is, the idea that the world may not be so dependable in the way that God has made it, as the conventional wisdom often suggests. This perspective looks at the world and sees that sometimes that there is an irreducible element of disorder and pathos in God's creation. An irreducible element of disorder and pathos in the order of things. We observe that the righteous are violated and not vindicated. We observe that the wicked prosper in their wickedness and are not stopped in their abuses. We observe that often nothing persists of the fruits of one's labor, right? You work hard, you pile up your goods, the goods of your labor, the fruits of your labor, and yet they dissipate. For this dissenting wisdom, even the ability to take joy in one's labor, let's assume that that is all one gets for one's labor. If you can't count on being able to keep the fruits of your labor, because they blow away in the wind, or the wicked come and steal them, or whatever happens to them, let's assume that you at least have the joy that you take in your labor as the reward for your labor, as suggested by Ecclesiastes. But Ecclesiastes will go on to say that even the joy that you take in your labor may be arbitrarily withheld from some people by God. Even that is something that some people get and other people don't get. I'm looking here at Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 26, for example. Your NRSV will say, "For to the one who pleases him God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy, but to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and heaping, only to give that stuff up to the one who pleases God." The word sinner here may very well also be translated bungler. And I'll give you my grounding for that, for example, if you were to look at Ecclesiastes 9, verse 18. And there, you'll see, wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one bungler destroys much good. The Hebrew word here translated bungler is the same as that translated sinner in chapter 2, verse 26. The sense that there is the one person who pleases God, and God gives that person wisdom and knowledge and joy. And then there's this other sort of born loser, this bungler, that God gives to this person the work of gathering and heaping, but they don't get to keep any of it. All the fruits of their labor get given over to the lucky duck, right? The one who pleases God. That is the sense that the bungler here, that he's done something wrong to deserve it, is not an idea that's introduced by Ecclesiastes. In the conventional wisdom, you sometimes get the idea that these strategies for survival offered by the conventional wisdom, the right action, the way that it's described, often sound almost like recipes for prosperity. Again, not a firm guarantee, but a sense of reliability that I think comes close to guarantee. The dissenting wisdom, for its part, does not offer courses of action that are going to help you do well or even survive, but rather seeks patience and shrewdness. The idea is to weather the storms of personal and impersonal injustice, to weather the storms that you undergo when you're dealt with badly by the wicked or simply by the tempests of the world. We'll see some examples of this kind of thought in our look at Ecclesiastes, especially in the way that Ecclesiastes seems to look at rule, at kingship, and then further in our more extended look at the structure and overall narrative of the book of Job. I said earlier that the book of Proverbs sees human rule as being fixed and sustained by God. And it's certainly also true that the book of Proverbs is aware of cases where the human ruler acts foolishly or wickedly. But that said, this conventional wisdom of the book of Proverbs is normally either silent on the question of whether the wicked or foolish human ruler meets his just deserts, or will seem to presuppose that he will. Another example is, for instance, the book of Daniel. If you look at the court tales of the book of Daniel, there are certainly cases where the human king, such as Nebuchadnezzar or Darius or Belshazzar, they certainly act foolishly or wickedly in the narratives. And yet you'll see in those court tales that one of two things happens pretty quickly. In the case of of Nebuchadnezzar or of the foolish Darius of Daniel 6, they come to their senses fairly quickly when confronted with God's active power and majesty. So, for example, in Daniel 4, Nebuchadnezzar, when he shows too much pride, is driven temporarily insane and by God, and eventually comes to his senses when confronted with that and changes his disposition. Or Darius, foolishly in the grip of the whims of his courtiers, winds up on the right side of things when he sees that Daniel survives his night in the lion's den. In Daniel 5, Belshazzar, by contrast, does not immediately repent of his foolishness when confronted with the writing on the wall, and he is killed that very night in his sleep. So there, with the conventional wisdom, we have the rapid redress of wickedness in the world. We can compare this to the dissenting wisdom, which is more agnostic about the fate of the wicked ruler. That is, it's acknowledged that the ruler may persist in his wickedness and be allowed to survive in his wickedness for some indefinite period of time, and so the trick becomes to survive in the presence of the wicked king until something happens to him. I'm going to want to make the argument that for the dissenting wisdom, this view of the human ruler carries over and reflects also its theology of God and God's power. So, for example, in Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verse 20, you get the admonishment not to badmouth the king, even when you're lying in your bed with your spouse, because Who knows if a bird might carry your word away and repeat it in the halls of power, right? So you may be, hustled out of your bed in the middle of the night. You may meet with a bad end. There's no place safe to speak badly about the king because the king's power extends everywhere, at least potentially. In a very similar mode, whereas Daniel 10 speaks about the king, Daniel 5, verse 1, tells you not to be rash with your mouth, to watch your mouth. And why? Because God is in heaven and you are on earth. God's power extends everywhere and your power is limited. You are only in one place at one time. God is over all. And so just as we watch our mouth with the king regarding the king in Daniel 10, so we watch our mouth with regard to God in Daniel? Ecclesiastes 10. So we watch our mouth with God in Ecclesiastes 5, and for the same reasons. Ecclesiastes chapter 6, verse 10 reminds us that against the stronger, human beings cannot dispute. And it's ambiguous. It could mean that human beings cannot dispute against humans who are stronger than them, or it may suggest that human beings as a class cannot dispute with the one who is stronger than human beings. Elsewhere, Ecclesiastes 8, verses 2 through 5, claims that the king will do whatever he pleases, and so you should do what the king says to do, no matter what it is. Again and again and again, the issue is not the goodness or the wisdom of the king, but rather his power. I'm reminded again of Daniel 1 through 6. Darius is a foolish king, but what matters is that foolish or not, he is the most powerful. Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, wicked and foolish, but the most powerful until and unless a stronger one can intervene or chooses to intervene against them. Against this backdrop of the question of greater or lesser power, it's understandable one would ask, what of justice? What confidence, if any, does the dissenting wisdom have that justice will prevail? Ecclesiastes 10, verse 5 and forward, says, it is as great an evil as if it proceeded from the ruler. An acknowledgement that evil does proceed from the ruler. And here, what is that evil? The evil is the situation of the whole world. That Ecclesiastes looks at the world and sees slaves are riding around on horseback like princes, and princes are going around on foot like as poor people. The world is upside down, topsy-turvy, and this is an evil that proceeds from the ruler. I'd spoken in the first half of this lecture about the royal theology, the Judean royal theology. This is obviously not the Judean royal theology, right, in which the king reflects the wisdom and beneficence of the God, and through the king are mediated God's blessings onto the people and onto the land, even onto the created order. A much more cynical view of what kind of evil may come forth from the human ruler, and I would argue also apparently the divine ruler. That is, that we experience God this way. Regardless of dogmatic convictions about God's goodness, we experience God on occasion as sending evil rather than good, as creating a nonsensical world and sustaining nonsense rather than creating and sustaining order. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 13 asks, "Who can make straight what God has made crooked?" And there it is, the conviction that God indeed does make things crooked, at least from time to time, and when God does so, it's beyond human capacity to make those crooked things straight. Besides this perspective on human and divine rule, as reflected in Ecclesiastes, before going on to see similar motifs in Job, I also want to point out another characteristic of the dissenting wisdom, that it sets the bait of the conventional wisdom before sort of demolishing it with or critiquing it with its dissenting wisdom. And we see this in Ecclesiastes, so I want to touch on it again before going on to see the same thing in a longer look at Job. So, Ecclesiastes 3, verses 1 through 8, which we looked at in the first part when talking about the conventional wisdom, 3, 1 through 8 offers an orderly, binary description of appropriate times for human action. But the following verses and the rest of the chapter seem to critique this kind of a calendar as a sort of busyness with which God has preoccupied mortals, almost to distract them from the fact that although God has put the idea of eternity into their mind, that God's ways with the world and the order with which God has imbued the world, if any, is something that we can never really figure out. And even insofar as we keep busy at this sort of calendar that we perceive in the world with the right times for the right seasons, that however successful we are at that, we eventually, the one who is successful at that dies and is forgotten, just the same as the one who does not, and even just as much as the animals with whom God has not given the idea of eternity. All go to the same place, regardless. In a very similar way, after Daniel 7 through 113, with its bromides about what is wise and what is foolish and its binary oppositions, immediately the following verses go on to talk about how God has made the day of joy as well as the day of adversity, and that we have no idea about distinguishing one from the other, very much in the same mode as the verses that follow Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8. Seeing that there are righteous people who suffer and die in their righteousness, and wicked people whose lives are prolonged in prosperity in their wickedness, Ecclesiastes makes the conclusion that one should not be too wise any more than one should be too foolish. One should not be too righteous any more than one should be too wicked. Rather, to keep a hand on them both, ready to jump with the winds, to jump with the way the wind blows, and do the one or the other, simply to try to get by as best one can. This is what the dissenting wisdom makes of the easy platitudinous binary oppositions of the conventional wisdom. 2 points to be made about the book of Job as a preamble to looking at its narrative concern the divine counsel and the role of the Satan or the Satan in the book of Job. Job is one. Job verses chapters 1 and 2 are among many texts in the Hebrew Bible that presuppose that God dwells in the midst of a divine council in the same way that a human king sits amidst courtiers. They're sometimes called B'nai HaElohim, the sons of the gods. That is to say, the members of the divine beings. In general, God is imagined as so powerful among these divine beings that there's no real possibility of rivalry. Although some texts, like Psalm 82, do seem to suggest a kind of struggle for supremacy, but that's very rare in the biblical text, especially compared to the texts of its neighbors, which do imagine more rivalry and struggle among the divine beings. But in the Hebrew Bible, God sort of sits among and above this council of divine beings, who are for the most part not active except in a very background way. Although, for example, 1 Kings 22 has an example of one of those divine beings acting in a fairly sketchy way. God calls upon this divine being to go and be a lying spirit in the mouth of in the mouth of King Ahab, the courtier, in the mouth of the prophets of the king of Israel. And that brings us to the role of the Satan in the book of Job. In 1 and 2, the divine council comes before God, and the Satan also is among them. The important thing to see here is that in the world of the Hebrew Bible, the Satan has not developed yet into the figure that we would understand as Satan. That is, as an evil being that stands opposed to God and opposed for God's will for creation. Rather, here and in texts like Zechariah 3, 1 through 8, the Satan is a member of the divine council that has the role of acting as an accuser. The word Satan means accuser. Acting as an accuser against a human being. Think, for example, in our justice system of the prosecuting attorney, the one whose job it is to make the best possible case for somebody's guilt, regardless for whether that person is actually guilty or even whether the prosecuting attorney thinks them guilty. Their role is to put that person in the most guilty possible light. And again, this is their role within the economy of God's rule over the world and the people in it. Now, in the book of Job, we see both narrative prose and also poetry, and the structure is important. The book begins and ends with a narrative prose frame, chapters 1 and 2, and 42, 7 to 17. And this prose narrative frame bookends a body of poetry. That is Job 3 all the way to chapter 42, verses 1 through 6. And to the reader of Hebrew especially, you see it even in your NRSVs and the way that the white space is laid out and such, but to the reader of Hebrew, the conventions of this poetry are so clear that the distinction between the prose narrative frame and the poetic body is very distinct. It absolutely cannot be missed. So in the opening, in the first couple chapters of narrative prose, you have the setting of the stage, the bet or the challenge that God makes, and that God initiates, I would point out, that God initiates with the Satan concerning Job's innocence. And then at the end, you have the vindication of Job and the rewarding of him. And in between, you have this many chapters of cycles of dialogue between Job and his friends, and eventually God coming in chapter 38 and sort of rendering thunderous pronouncements of chapters 38, 30, over two long cycles in 38, 39, 40, and 41. And our task then is to try to make sense not only of the narrative frame and not only of the poetic body, but of the work as we receive it in its entirety. Now, in her commentary on the book of Job, Carol Newsom has the intriguing idea of making this experiment. Imagine if we only had the narrative frame. You have the setting of the wager between God and the Satan. What would happen with this righteous person if we just clobber the heck out of him? Will he remain faithful, or will he break because will it turn out that his faithfulness is only rooted in the benefits that he receives from God? And in that beginning, Job does have an opponent. His wife urges him to curse God and die. That is, go ahead and just curse God so that he'll hit you with lightning or whatever, and you can end this horrible suffering that you're undergoing. Because remember, they've had their children have been killed, their land taken away, all by this wager that's been initiated by God with the Satan. And then Job's friend and Job replies with these truisms. Oh, naked I came into this world, naked I shall go out. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Shall we receive the good from the Lord and not also receive the bad? Blessed be the name of the Lord. His wife seems to, then his friends come and sit around him in silence, and that's where we leave him. Now imagine going straight from there to chapter 42, verses 7 to 17, where what happens? God is suddenly on the scene. The Satan is nowhere to be found. God is on the scene, and God is saying that Job has spoken rightly of God, whereas the friends have not. And therefore Job is rewarded and the friends are blamed. Carol Newsom's point is it would be understandable if that's all we had to think, oh, well, when we left Job, he was being silent while his wife urged him to blaspheme. He was uttering these platitudinous truisms about God's justice. And so we would assume that that is the way in which Job has spoken rightly of God, and that the friends have joined with the wife, perhaps, in urging him to blaspheme God, to go ahead and say that God is unjust and be done with it. And if this were the case, this would be a classic example of the conventional wisdom. Job the silent, Job the patient, sticks with God even in the face of adversity, and is rewarded for it. The problem is that that's not the book that we receive, because in the book that we receive, all those chapters in between show us that Job breaks Job's silence. And in a cycle of dialogues with the three friends, Job complains bitterly that God is unjust in God's dealings with him and with others in the world. And it's the friends who offer the platitudinous truisms over and over again that if a person is suffering, it's because they've sinned, or at worst, that God is testing them to see if they'll come through in the end, and that they ought to stay silent and be rewarded in the end, against the blaspheming complaint that Job offers throughout those chapters. So, for example, Job in chapter 9, and I'm looking especially at verses 13 to 24, Job 9, 13 to 24, Job repeatedly makes the claim that there ought to be an umpire or a referee that could stand between himself and God, someone who could stand between them and judge his case. That if this is a contest of strength, God is certainly the stronger and will win. And if it's it's a matter of justice, who can tell God that God is being unjust? Nobody, because God is the most powerful. So if only hypothetically there were this stronger one, someone stronger than God, who could stand over God and vindicate Job against the unjust God. In that same chapter 9, verses 32 and 33, if only we could go to court together and there were an umpire between us, then my case would be vindicated. It's essential to remember that we know Job's innocence. We know it from the voice of the narrator, and we know it from God, right, from the very first two chapters. So this is not a matter of a person who simply thinks himself innocent, but we have it on the highest authority that in fact he is. Chapter 19, similarly, in its final verses, 19 verse 7 and also 23 to 27. Translation is difficult, and I'm not sure that the NRSV, for example, does the best it could, especially by capitalizing Redeemer as if that referred to God. Again, Job is saying here that he wishes his case could be inscribed in rock and written in lead, so that after he dies, because he feels he's plainly going to die, that his complaint against God might persist after his death in the hopes that someday there will be such a redeemer, such an umpire, such a referee to stand between him and God even after he is no longer in the flesh. And then what happens in response to this? From chapters 38 forward, God comes along and does exactly what Job had anticipated he would do back in chapter 9. That although he is innocent, God will come along and fill the air with words, demonstrating that God is more powerful than Job. Job has framed his question in terms of justice, and God has answered him only in terms of power. In that context, I think it's where then we find ourselves looking again at the end of the story. What does it mean when God says that Job has spoken rightly of God? And his friends have not. His friends have been the ones defending God all along, and Job has been the one accusing God. And God claims that Job is the one who has spoken rightly of him. Some will point to Job's words in chapter 42, 1 through 6, where he seems to finally knuckle under and to say, God, you're right about everything. But looking closely at that, one wonders whether Job is not simply doing what Ecclesiastes has urged us to do in the presence of the unjust and volatile-tempered king. In the face of the God who has shouted, "Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge?" Job responds that he has uttered what he didn't understand. Does that mean that he didn't understand that it's all to the best anyway, or does it mean that he didn't understand just how unsatisfying God's response to him would be, answering questions of justice with mere assertions of power? It may be that the book of Job, in the end, is not trying to ultimately solve or resolve the questions that preoccupy the dissenting wisdom folk, but rather presents us with a kind of limit case, an extreme case, in which to walk around and size up the situation. The completely righteous and just man who is completely and arbitrarily clobbered by God. The man who complains unceasingly against God and is vindicated by that same God in that complaint. I would say in other areas of the Bible, besides just the wisdom literature, it's worth asking this question: is the Bible trying to reach closure on the theological questions that we might habitually bring to the Bible, or is it sometimes providing a narrative or other kind of stage or framework in which those questions can be fruitfully explored? You'll sometimes have a sense that what's being argued is that you have two rival schools of wisdom between the conventional wisdom and the dissenting wisdom. Uh, Others point out there's not much evidence for that, for these rival schools with their rival perspectives. I think rather we can say that the wisdom movement as a whole, grounded as it is in experience, in a human experience of the world, rather than in dogmas and doctrines about the history of God's saving acts with the world. Being grounded in experience, it's natural that wisdom would come to reflect these two kinds of human experience. The experience of the world as a good place that makes sense, and the experience of the world as a confusing place that doesn't make sense, even a threatening, arbitrary world. I hope you've enjoyed this two-part episode on biblical wisdom. And if you enjoyed it or thought you got something out of it, I hope you'll look forward to other episodes in the series introducing the Tanakh. Thank you.